there's pretty clearly something special about our moon. The moon is pretty much the same size, apparently, to us as the sun. And that's just an incredible astronomical coincidence. Like, even if you don't believe in all this woo-woo astrology stuff, you have to wonder at that. Like, because the chances of that are so incredibly small. The moon is exactly the right size and distance to cover the sun precisely, or almost precise, very close to precise. And that's the only moon, as far as I'm aware, in our solar system that does that. So no other planet has a moon that is equal in sort of apparent visual weight somehow to the sun. And that's like incredible. And that's one of the things that I realized that quite a while ago, before I got into astrology. And when I did realize it, I found it quite incredible. I was like, this is something to wonder at. And this is something to make you ponder, what are the chances of this? Because we, as far as we're aware, we have one planet in this solar system that has conscious minds that could appreciate such a thing. And there we are. We have the two symbols, the giver of light and the reflector of light, being perfectly balanced. And there's something very elegant and very strange and almost miraculous about that.
We have been given the scientific knowledge, the technical ability, and the materials to pursue the exploration of the universe. To ignore these great resources would be a corruption of a God-given ability.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Stefan. Today for Stefan Burns Live number 4, I'm joined by Dan Waits with World Astrology Report. You can find him on YouTube there. You can find him on his website at danwaitsastrology.com, where he does private astrology readings. So Dan, thanks so much for joining us on this channel for this podcast to talk about astrology and everything in between.
Thanks so much for having me, Stefan. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And I discovered Dan through his channel. I just like astrology, and your videos started to pop up. And I found them really interesting because a lot of astrology videos and podcasts and et cetera are all very current. It's like, here's this new moon, here's this full moon, here's this retrograde, whatever. Some of them are a little longer, but yours are interesting because you mix like geopolitics and these long, like, history trends, like these very long period waves, very low frequency, and you look at the astrology and find how they connect and the evidence. So I feel like it's in many ways making astrology a little bit more scientific. Like, astrology is a Vedic science, but in terms of like Western science, I feel like you have a little bit of a scientific analytical mind that you apply to this, which captured my interest. And also these are interesting topics. So go check out his channel if you like history, geopolitics, astrology, things of that nature, folks. But if you could just maybe, let's start off, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and maybe what you did.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm currently a professional astrologer, and I run the YouTube channel that you've been talking about, World Astrology Report. And what the channel's about is really in the name. It's about world astrology. So, as people know a lot about natal astrology, the kind of astrology of, individuals' lives, horoscopes, all that kind of thing. What I'm focused on is the astrology of the world. There are a lot of techniques that you can use in astrology which allow you to really see how history moves and evolves over time. So one of the things I'm really interested in is planetary cycles. There are a lot of different cycles involving the planets, and they seem to coincide with different historical processes. So a lot of what I do on my channel is I'm looking back in time at what's happened earlier on in these planetary cycles, what happened when similar things happened in the past, rather than just purely making kind of symbolic reasoning, which is also an important part of astrology. I'm always trying to look back in the past and see kind of when we had this configuration before, say when we had this Saturn-Pluto conjunction before, what were the kind of events that happened? And that really helps in terms of, I think, understanding astrology, understanding where things are going. So yeah, it is a big part of my approach. There's always an element of magic to astrology. I don't think we can hide that. It is a part of astrology, but we can take a kind of sort of empirical approach as well, and that was really how astrology was developed. It was developed by people literally watching the sky and noticing patterns in terms of what they were seeing up there and the kind of events that happen on Earth. So that's the kind of approach that I take to my astrology. That's what my channel's about. I actually have a history in humanitarian work. And I spent a lot of time traveling around the world for an international humanitarian organization. It was an organization focused on armed conflict. So what I used to do in my kind of previous life, before I lost the plot and became an astrologer, is I
lost your mind.
Yeah, before I went completely off the deep end, is that I was working for this organization, traveling the world and working in different places and understanding and analyzing geopolitical trends and what was happening in conflict. So sort of thinking about the world, thinking about current events, geopolitics is not really a new thing for me. But when I became an astrologer, I, of course, brought in the extra knowledge that we can get from astrology.
That's what I really, that's one of the things that I tell a lot of young people, because like right now I'm in a Russian language class and I'm meeting a lot of young people because they're coming in for their summer break. And I tell them, learn 2 skills at a minimum. Like whatever your school is, whatever, maybe do 2 majors. But when you have those 2 skills or 3 or 4 or 5, and then you can put them together and overlap them, that's when like the real magic happens. And so it's cool that I didn't, that you had that prior experience there, the humanitarian efforts, and then to overlap that with astrology. I know I got into astrology because, I don't know, someone like, I guess mentioned it or like made a compelling of enough case for me to like look at all my different, your Jupiter's in Leo, this means that. And I read through it and I was like, this is pretty spot on. What is it that got you into astrology? Was there like a mentor or a friend that was really influential, or you just somehow just pulled you in like it does? Or
yeah, good question. So I really grew up, and then in my later life, I had a very conventional view of the world. I didn't really believe in astrology. I didn't have a strong opinion on it. I didn't know anything about it, but I kind of presumed what you know about it, you see in newspaper horoscopes and so on, sun sign astrology. And, I just didn't take it seriously. But in my travels, I lived in Asia for a long time. I lived in places like Thailand, Myanmar, Fiji, Papua New Guinea. These are all places where, the world of spirits, or, perhaps we can even call it magic, a magical view of the world is very common. This is just how a lot of people see the world in those places. And that eventually just kind of, I think, just seeped in to my mentality. I started to think, to the people around me, this stuff is completely real. It's not just that they believe it and I know better. You eventually just start to realize that's kind of an arrogant mentality, or at least that's what I thought it was. I started to become more open to the possibility that the kind of things that people in spirit, who in spiritual traditions have been saying for a long time have some validity. So it just made me curious, and I did the same as you. Actually, I got interested in astrology and started to learn a bit about how to read a chart, and just started to see that. I started to see truth in what I was reading. I was like, this just seems to work a bit better than it should. Yeah. And that was really what drew me in. And then I was also interested in planetary cycles and history and all that kind of stuff. At least I got interested in that. I read a book called Cosmos and Psyche by a famous astrologer named Richard Tarnas, who's also a professor of philosophy. And he was talking about planetary cycles and history. And he takes a very serious approach. It's very extremely erudite, well-researched, and serious. And I would really recommend people to check that book out if they're interested in seeing how astrology can be done with real, like, intellectual heft. And so I was reading his books, and then a lot of astrologers' blogs as well. This was like quite a few years ago. And they were all talking about 2020 as well, and about how 2020 is going to be this big year some sort of great transformation, some societal reset. They're using all these very dramatic words and saying that the things that are going to happen in that year that are going to be extremely challenging and are going to have like really big knock-on effects and change the world essentially. And I remember sort of not, finding that a little bit scary sounding, not being particularly keen on whatever that promised. And I kind of put it to the back of my mind, kind of thinking, well, these they're probably wrong, right? This is surely, and then of course 2020 rolled round, and
we know what happened there, folks.
we know what happened there, and that really got me to decide that I would take astrology 100% seriously from that time, and it really spurred me to do a lot of research into cycles, because you can, the pandemic came very close to a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. So I started researching, well, is there any truth of this? What does happen when these two planets meet? And I started to see these patterns, which I just couldn't ignore, and really obsessed me, actually.
Yeah, what I find interesting is like you have actual planetary alignment. Like planetary geometry and astrology are different, but they rely on the same thing. And that's like an actual factual thing, right? Like the symbology aspect and everything, the magic, spirits, that's kind of a different dimension of reality, which has quantum physics that supports it. Just it's not like, again, very well known or understood. But like you can actually, once we figured out the cosmos, our little neighborhood at least, it's like, okay, these two planets are in exact opposition to each other with Earth in the middle. And that's really interesting. How, based on your research, based on the research of, thousands or more astrologers, and just keeping good notes, that's what science is. It's just keeping track of the data as it rolls in. It does match up. And by the way, we'll put a link to that book in the video description. So if you're interested, I'll probably buy that book and read it myself based on your recommendation. So thanks for that. One thing I do find kind of interesting is that, in the past, like Göbekli Tepe, which is that like Turkish, ancient not even Neolithic, but like Paleolithic site, is that they rebuilt it multiple times to line up with the changing the changing rise and set of the sun for the equinox and et cetera. And one of the things that I have people commenting on my channel for when I do talk astrology just a little bit is, well, you should look into sidereal astrology, because everything's like, what's precession? I think we've undergone a bit of precession. So what are your thoughts on sidereal astrology compared to like Western, and how, I guess, the moon is, or the, Jupiter's actually in this sign versus what it was 2,000 years ago. And now there's different symbology with that.
Yeah. So yeah, this is one of the big questions really in astrology, tropical versus sidereal astrology. In tropical astrology, which is mostly practiced in the West, we actually take the signs, or the 12 signs of the zodiac. They're defined by the Earth and the seasons on Earth. We take into account the equinoxes and the solstices. These are where we start the what we call the cardinal tropical signs in Western astrology. Whereas
Aries for spring, it's the beginning of spring.
Exactly. So this way of defining the signs is very ancient as well. It goes back thousands of years. And sidereal astrology pays more attention to the actual constellations. That's how the signs are defined. That said, the signs even in sidereal astrology are idealized, because the constellations are really, the constellations of the zodiac, they're different sizes. They're not all exactly 30 degrees. Which is what you get in any zodiacal system. You have 30-degree signs. So it's a question of orientation. It's a question of one thing that I also am I see a sidereal astrologer, Indian astrologer myself, and he's absolutely brilliant. And there are brilliant tropical astrologers as well. What I discussed this with him, and the way he put it was, it's like we're looking at the same things, but from a different angle, essentially. It's really a question of perspective, but you can, but both systems seem to be somehow self-contained, self-referencing in a way that they are internally consistent, and at the same time also are able to make true statements about our lives as well. So yeah, that's my perspective. I take a fairly open one. I think there are a lot of different approaches that work.
That's what I find interesting. It's like you believe in astrology, right? And it's like all this kind of nebulous concepts, and it's definitely in like the air dimension. But then you'll be very strict on, oh, well, it has to be that system or that system. So it's like these arbitrary breakdowns. But yeah, I like the fact that it's looking at things different ways. That's honestly probably a good thing, because it allows us to get different perspectives. And do a lot of astrologers learn both methods? Like you're learning this method from your mentor in this, or
there are there are quite a lot of astrologers. I mean, not tons, but there are some astrologers that use both, and that's a fairly complex approach, because you're kind of getting two reads on every symbol that you're reading there. I am studying Vedic sidereal astrology, but I don't practice it with my clients. I'm not really at the stage of understanding or mastery yet where I could do that. Who knows in the future at some point. I mean, there is a lot of overlap, because even though the signs are defined differently, when Mars opposes Saturn, that applies no matter which of the systems you're using. So there's a lot of, one thing about the Indian Vedic tradition of astrology is it goes back thousands of years of uninterrupted practice. And we can't really say that here in the West, because astrology, especially the traditional techniques and knowledge was kind of lost for a while. It's only really astrology was kind of revived in the West in maybe the late 19th century, and then the kind of astrology that was practiced in the 20th century was very new. It was a very different approach to how astrology had been practiced by the ancients. And it's only been relatively recently that we've started to recover the wisdom of these like ancient astrologers with the translating ancient texts from in ancient Greek or from Arabic, or all these different traditions that were out there. Whereas with Vedic Indian astrology, there's really been a uninterrupted tradition where the knowledge has been handed down, often within families. So there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from taking Vedic and Indian astrology very seriously, and I do.
You mentioned the Mars-Saturn opposition, and it made me think about how that's actually fairly common, because Mars is rotating fairly quick. It's like, what, every 2 years? There's a rotation every 2.5, something like that. So, and then in regards to like recovering some of the information that we lost, in many ways that like falls on the shoulders of people like you to like go back, create those old charts, dive into the history, and then, and let's say with like Mars and Saturn in opposition, that would present a lot of data points, because that happens at a fairly regular tempo. And then, of course, there are different signs and everything, but you could get a pretty big, you could think of like an Excel spreadsheet, right? You could get a pretty big data list and then analyze that for trends. Is that something that you do in your like spare time with, let's say, faster transits like that, or you're more focused really just on the generational planets, outer planets, Pluto, Neptune, Uranus?
Yeah, so I do pay quite a bit of attention to that cycle, the Mars-Saturn cycle. As you say, yeah, 2 years. I mean, these were the two planets that the traditional astrologers called the two malefic planets. When they say malefic, they mean that they tend to be associated with experiences that we humans find unpleasant, essentially.
The baddies.
Yeah, the two bad guys, the destroyers. And that cycle actually has a special place in traditional astrology, because the ancients actually did look at that cycle. That 2-year cycle of Mars and Saturn was seen as the kind of, you could call it like the cycle of woe. It was just, you know, a 2-year cycle that really spoke to the more unpleasant things that happen in the world. You know, the four horsemen and plagues and wars and all this kind of stuff. So I also do look at that cycle, because you can see shorter stories playing out with these shorter cycles. I mean, any cycle of 2 planets will be telling stories, and that's what I'm always looking for. You know, what story is this cycle telling? And I do that with Mars Saturn, and you could absolutely do a huge amount of research, because, as you say, you have a lot of data points. It's quite painstaking research, because you kind of need each story that a cycle like that might be telling is an it's very it's not sort of generic. It might be about, for example, we had a conjunction of those planets in early 2020, and you can look at that cycle and see when those 2 planets were making major aspects. We had big moments in the COVID-19 pandemic. That was the major story it was talking about. And we saw the emergence of like major variants, you know, the different variants of COVID that came out around the time of these major aspects. And then the next conjunction came in early 2022. And this is the cycle that we're in now. It hasn't finished yet, but it's speaking about the Ukraine war, among other things. And again, when we've seen major aspects in this cycle, we've had important developments in the story of the conflict. So it does.
I think the grain deal just fell through for the opposition.
Yes.
So that's a pretty big one. What's more woeful, the conjunction or the opposition?
Well, you couldn't really. I'm not sure you could kind of put it like, well, woeful. I'm not sure what the woefulest of those is. I mean, they were different in kind, really. It's the conjunction is kind of the sort of a seed moment where the thing that's the thing that we're going to be dealing with comes into being, whereas the opposition is like the kind of full flowering of that thing. It can often be a moment of where there's a turning point, a change in direction, because before the opposition, we're in a waxing phase. If you think about it like the moon, because the moon is the sun and moon create another one of these cycles. So we're up to the opposition, the full moon, so to speak. We're in a waxing phase, and then beyond that, we're in a waning phase. Yeah.
So that just makes me think about, you looked at my chart really quick. And for folks that don't know, I have a whole bunch of stuff in Leo. We just had a Venus retrograde start. So, or for anyone that has this combination, you could say, this type of scenario play out, when you have a retrograde and it hits your point 3 times, let's say natally, is that like 3 different seeding moments? Like it's adding even more energy to whatever's going to grow from that, you would say, or using that same kind of way to describe it, how could you maybe explain like a retrograde, a fast retrograde over some points like this Venus one will do? Curious.
Yeah. So what you will tend to see when that happens, and it's quite common, right? Where you'll you know, especially because the outer planets will retrograde every year. So it's pretty common, and you get when you get 3 hits of the planet with a natal placement, then you will tend to see a story with kind of punctuation marks at those hits. So what we're often doing as astrologers is we'll be looking for, say, with this Venus retrograde story, what happened when Venus entered the sign of Leo? The sign is where the story is taking place. And then what happened when it made, say, when it entered what it's called its shadow? Its shadow, it's maybe a bit hard to visualize, but what the shadow is that in the future, the planet is going to station retrograde and move backwards. and then it's going to turn round and move forwards again when it stations direct. The shadow is where it reaches the point where it will station direct. So when it gets into the shadow, that's often where you'll start to see the story, an event happening there, things are getting set up somehow. And then as it moves forward, often it'll also make hits with, say, a particular natal point, a planet, a natal placement. And again, we'll see events at these times. So, what an astrologer will do, or somebody who uses astrology a lot, will really track these things. I mean, if you're somebody who journals, it's really helpful if you start to note down, like, what happened when at this point in this retrograde, what happened at this point, and you'll tend to see stories.
That's the scientific method at play, folks. That's how you do it, is you take, keep track of this data. And so it's interesting that at the same time you have this scientific focus to help you understand astrology, but like, it's also difficult to kind of apply the scientific, like the hard scientific method, to some of these things that exist beyond, you could say, like conventional science, like archetypes and stories and how things play out, and those type of cycles, which have permutated over time. I mean, we have Greek mythology, which is based on even older pagan beliefs, and then it itself was pagan. Then it goes into Roman, and then it gets converted into Christianity. And you're really tracking these stories across time. What's a big one that you see playing out over the next decade? That's important. It's like, what we had this big 2020, maybe that's like the seed moment because there's that conjunction. So over the next decade, or expand the timeline if needed, what's a punctuation mark that you see coming up that maybe we should just have a little bit more front of mind than what we normally do?
Yeah. Well, there are a few. 2026 is the year, I think, that stands out more than any other over this decade. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that in 2026, we're going to see a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. Now, these conjunctions happen roughly every 40 years or so, a bit less than that.
Because Saturn's moving quick, not because of Neptune, but because Saturn's on a 30-year cycle.
Exactly. Okay. So Saturn becomes almost the fast planet in a cycle like that. Now these conjunctions, if we look back in history, they tend to coincide with pretty big moments, even over the 20th century. If we look at, there was a conjunction in 1917. This is the Russian Revolution. And this Russian history seems to resonate very closely to this cycle. 1917, the Russian Revolution. 53, we have the death of Stalin, another Saturn-Neptune conjunction. 89, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall, another Saturn-Neptune conjunction. We have one coming in 2026. So it's
good.
Yeah, these tend to be big moments, and as I say, particularly as it pertains to Russian history, you'll find that different peoples, different states, they often resonate more strongly to different cycles. And for some reason, Saturn Neptune is the one that Russia really resonates to. So that's a big moment. And the interesting thing about the Saturn Neptune conjunction of 2026 is that it's happening at 0 degrees of Aries.
Yeah.
Now, 0 degrees of Aries, if you think of it, there are 360 degrees in the zodiac. Each sign contains 30, and 0 degrees of Aries is the first degree of the entire zodiac, which seems rather significant, right? I mean, this is the very first degree, so you have to think that there is something new being born at this time. Something
Your creation.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at the zodiac as a kind of a story that tells a story of life as we move through different phases of life and creation. And Aries, of course, being the first sign, is about about coming into being, coming into this world. So we have this this conjunction happening then, which is something a lot of astrologers are paying attention to. And then we also have some really interesting outer planet configurations as well in the same year. So roughly July 2026, we're going to have Pluto and Uranus in a exact trine. So you can imagine that a trine is a 120-degree aspect in astrology, but then in the middle of that, making a sextile to both, is Neptune. So there's so there's this very elegant configuration of these three outer planets, and it's what we call, these are all flowing aspects. So this is an important moment in several different cycles. It's happening; they're all coming together in 2026 at the same time. This is something that I've talked about quite a bit on my channel. We've tried to come up, to forecast what this could be about. But there's no doubt that 2026 is going to be a big year.
Well, one thing that I study a lot and talk about on my channel, and I'm increasingly giving this more attention and educating more on. It's a difficult subject to teach on because it involves being able to perceive things beyond our normal 24-hour cycle, but that's like these wave periods and how they can, just yesterday, I filmed a video on how waves construct together and deconstruct. So you have two waves and they'll add, and the wave will double in height as a result, or sometimes they completely are out of phase and they'll go to zero. And something that adds on to this 2026 is that is estimated to be the very kind of end of solar maximum for solar cycle 25. We've had a solar cycle that's so far broken the NASA records, but they're pretty new to this, so that's to be expected. But it's estimated to kind of top out around end of 24, 25, maybe even early 26. And these solar maximums are kind of these plateaus where the sun is the most unstable with this magnetic field, so it's emitting the most energy. And so, for example, the total solar irradiance, the total amount of light energy, electromagnetic energy the sun emits during solar maximum, isn't that much more than it is during solar minimum, on the grand scale, though maybe that's still significant to us. But things like X-ray radiation, that specific high frequency wavelength, that often has been measured to go up an order of magnitude, 10x more. And these extreme ultraviolet wavelengths, these X-ray wavelengths, say even gamma waves with a big coronal mass ejection solar flare, whatever, these huge energy explosions on the sun, those are the ones that more preferentially will hit our ionosphere, upper atmosphere, and cause it to change its characteristics in such a way that it then creates electric currents in the ground that are different than normal. And based on my research that I've done, and my own personal experience, is that we connect to that bioelectrically. We evolved in these energy fields. And so when you're standing out there barefoot, you're taking in these telluric currents, these telluric signals that contain information that was downregulated from the sun through various systems. First, it had to get through our magnetosphere, then the ionosphere, then it's put into the ground surface, then it goes into you. But it's interesting that cycle is going to, it seems, this is pretty likely, it'll be at the end or kind of top out right at the time of that energy convergence that you talked about between the planetary geometry. The solar cycle happens every 11 years where it'll flip its pole, but still that's almost again, 0 degrees of Aries. It's feeding a bunch of energy to us that we actually consciously interact with. And they've done, there's a group called HeartMath that has looked at these changes with solar rhythms and such, and shown that global consciousness, these significant events that happen, change when there's more energy coming in. People become, I guess, just more, I don't want to say agitated, but just more energetically alive in such a way that things are more likely to happen. People aren't as sleepy, you could say. So there's another energy convergence happening with this 2026 conjunction between Neptune and Saturn. But Neptune has yeah.
No, I was just going to say that's fascinating. I wasn't aware of that that's what we call in astrology, we'll talk about confluence, when you have multiple techniques that are lining up at a particular time and highlighting a particular year or particular day. And when you get that tends to increase your confidence that things are really going to happen at that time.
Another interesting thing for you to think about, this is why I wanted us to get on and do a podcast so we could do this, is that, of course, Neptune is like ruler of the oceans, but also, and jump in if I need to get corrected, he's often attributed to like earthquakes and any sort of like earth type calamity in some ways, like tsunamis, earthquakes, etc. And then Saturn, of course, is like the 3D manifester. And at the end of solar cycles, it's not at the beginning phase, it's after the Earth has been loaded with all that energy, is when we see the most significant earthquakes happen during a solar cycle. And they have maybe like 60, 70, 80 years of data for that now. So it's like pretty good data. I mean, ideally we could go way back, but it seems that at the tail end of a solar cycle is when you have the strongest, most significant earthquakes, like the highest magnitude and at the highest frequency of occurrence. And that kind of matches with the symbolism and the story of those two coming together, at least in my mind, and in Aries, which is like, creation, boom energy.
Yeah, that well, one of the I think Uranus is a planet that we often associate with earthquakes as well, and
okay,
at the same, Uranus is kind of sudden disruptions and very sudden changes. Neptune, of course, as you rightly say, is has to do with the ocean. What it's also has to do with is kind of in a more less in a less literal sense. Neptune has to do with consciousness, themes like faith and mysticism, these kind of the intangibles. If you say we kind of come from an ocean of consciousness and return to it after we leave this world. So we have Saturn and Neptune coming together. As you say, Saturn having to do with what is really manifest in the world, what's concrete and tangible. Bringing those two things together, the very intangible and the tangible is what this cycle has to do with. And there's some sense, so it's often sometimes we've seen like grand schemes that aim to make the intangible real somehow. For example, the communist revolution in 1917, there's this kind of Neptunian dream that everybody is fundamentally the same and equal, and in that system we're trying to really make that real, with a system that treats everybody the same, pays everybody the same, etc. So what we're wondering about with 2026 is kind of what intangible universalist scheme or idea is going to be kind of made manifest at this time. That's one of the ways we're thinking about it.
And it could also have global propagation, because this is the first time this conjunction, if it's a 40-year cycle, first time this conjunction will happen in like the actual internet era. It's back in the 80s, doesn't count. So everyone will have access to what's happening with that if something happens, according to astrology. I like to add that, like, according to astrology, it's proven true, it seems, but I'm not Nostradamus. So at least for my own sake. Yeah, that'll be interesting. Anything else beyond 2026, like later in the decade, or that's really kind of the big moment that you're seeing in the near future that's worth examining?
That 2026 and kind of the lead up to 2026 is big, because we see a few of the outer planets are changing signs in 2025, 2026.
Uranus and what else? Pluto
Uranus
finally changes.
Yeah, Pluto is changing over the course of 2023 and 2024, and then 2025 we see Uranus and then Neptune. So yeah, that's a big moment. 2028 is interesting as well, for different reasons. The reason I'm looking at 2028 is that that's when we have Saturn and Pluto in a kind of 90-degree square aspect. Now, that's the square is seen as a kind of an aspect of friction. It's seen to be of the nature of Mars. It has to do with conflict and friction, action as well. And if we're trying to think, what might this have to do with the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, which this square is coming from, happened in 2020. This is the thing I was referring to at the start. And I was talking about how COVID emerged in early or late 2019, early 2020. We have a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto on January the 12th, 2020. I think it was January the 11th. The first news story comes out saying somebody's died of a mysterious virus in Wuhan, China. So the exactitude of that's pretty eye-opening. But essentially, when we get to the square between these two planets, whatever's coming at that time is going to have to do with what was put into play, what was kind of originated in those early days of the pandemic. We're going to see an important moment in the story that was initiated at that time in 2028.
So based on the fact that that significant astrology happened at that moment with a very significant world event that's still ongoing, those seems to be quiet right now. You think that perhaps this is a pretty long cycle. This is like a 35-year cycle or something that we're entering into, and this is going to play out for a while, but perhaps it'll permutate different ways.
Yeah. So essentially, what we're looking at with astrology, we're looking at kind of many different cycles that are all overlaid on top of each other, happening at the same time, and these different cycles, of course, have to do with different aspects of life, and we know which aspects based on the meanings that we've seen that are associated with the different planets. Now, so this Saturn-Pluto cycle, it's a very challenging cycle. It's it has Saturn being the planet associated with limitation, restriction, even death and things as blunt as that. Pluto too also has association with death, because Pluto is the lord of the underworld, Hades. We see these kind of underworld themes, these eruptions from beneath when Pluto's involved, and we also see things taken to extremes. Extreme restriction is one way you could delineate Saturn, Pluto. Extreme limits, extreme restriction, and of course that was very much what happened during the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't really get a more literal expression of those two planetary archetypes. So what we're not, those two planets aren't really they're not really dialoguing much at the moment, right? So they're not at a major aspect. So it can be it's quite normal that there's certain things bubble up at the time of the conjunction, and then we don't really see, or exactly. Yes, it becomes less visible, less obvious, and then at each major aspect, we start to see expressions again of what was initiated at the conjunction, and that's what we'll see. I think quite evidently in 2028 when those two planets reach a square. What could that be? There's lots of possibilities. One possibility, of course, is some sort of another virus, perhaps, or something like that. But then there were a lot of other themes that go with the pandemic. There's all the. It was a very difficult time in a lot of societies. There was a lot of conflict over the question of how do we deal with this. How do we, what's the correct way for the state to approach this? What technologies is it appropriate for the state to use to manage this? People had very different ideas about this, and it created, a lot of discord, a lot of conflict. And the states also came up with all sorts of new technologies and systems to kind of try and manage this situation using as you say, now we're in this kind of the internet era. So suddenly we have all this kind of, the information technology employed to try and manage this thing. So those are also themes that could come up again somehow at that time. And then another thing to look at is that we really saw a massive degradation, not sure that's the right word, but decline in the relations between, say, the US and China at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the virus emerged from China. There was a lot of anger over
Funded
that.
by us.
funded by you guys, yeah. And
Not me.
not you personally, but
yes.
But so we saw a lot of tension between the US and China really come to the surface at that time. That's another theme that I have my eye on as a possibility for 2028.
I'm going to blow your mind right now. I'm just going to touch on this a little bit. I haven't really mentioned this at all on my channel before because it's too hot button, but this is the time to do it. The guy I used to work for a geophysical equipment manufacturer. So they made seismographs and magnetometers and things. And the guy who founded the company back in 1969, he was this geophysicist, PhD from Stanford, really brilliant, kind of eccentric guy. He discovered the Olmec heads, if you know those big heads from Mexico. I'll put a photo up here. And so he discovered those with help from the villagers in the jungles of Mexico. And then after he left the company, he started all these venture capital projects. This is the Bay Area. And he has an interesting website. So I go on his website back in July of August of 2020, and I found a book manuscript that he wrote where it was written in 2006, and then he created the new cover in 2009. And it has been sitting on his website for a decade or so. And I have those dates just because that's what the Word document says. But no one goes on this website. And I don't think so, at least I did. And so I download this manuscript, and basically he talks about a pneumonia-like virus that was engineered that comes out of Wuhan, China. It's coronavirus. They call it coronavirus. And it's this whole story about how the thing's been engineered to cause health problems 5 years down the road. And it's a big geopolitical thing. And it was really kind of crazy because it was exactly boom, boom, boom in terms of what actually happened with the pandemic. So I don't want to get into more than that, but I mentioned it because I'm going to put some sort of link to that in the video description, and I'll send that to you as well if you want to read that. But it was really just this is kind of crazy how this guy wrote this back in 2006, and specifically was talking about mRNA technology. And he knew about that because he was in this venture capital field and diving into some of these things for Alzheimer's and the brain and such. But who knew about that back then? No one knew about it back then.
Yeah, that's mind-blowing.
Yeah, so there's these interesting synchronicities, and I haven't shared it with I've shared it with close friends and family, but I haven't shared it on any social media platform yet, just because earlier it would have been kind of maybe a red flag or something. So, but I'll send that to you if you want to read that manuscript, folks. Check it out in the video description. See what you think. Share your comments. One question I have about these Pluto cycles, also I can see how that plays out with viral engineering. Maybe it's just viral engineering, societal factors. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out. But this cycle with Saturn and Pluto takes 35 or so years. It's a fairly long one. Pluto moves so slow. Why is Pluto this small little planet that wasn't discovered until 1907, something like that, just a little bit more than 100 years ago? Why does Pluto have such a big seat in astrology, at least in the Western system?
Yeah, that's a really
the symbology of it.
That's a really good question. So one place to start with that is just the idea that astrology is about cosmos and psyche. It's about the idea that the cosmos and the psyche, the mind, are reflective of each other, that they're somehow identified. Now, Pluto very, as you say, very far out. You can't see it. It's relatively small. We don't really have access to it. One of the things that we associate with Pluto in astrology is the unconscious. Pluto has to do with the unconscious, with things that emerge from the unconscious of great power that change the world now, or our lives. So you can kind of see the cosmos a little bit like that, or the solar system. Say the sun, extremely visible, the biggest thing. And in astrology we associate that with consciousness, with our spirit, with the divine spark, which is looking out. It's ever present. We all know it's there. Few people would deny it. It's our own self, our own ego is kind of the loudest thing in the world, and the brightest thing. And yet we know very well that often our behavior has to do with unconscious processes, with things that we don't have access to, we can't see. And it's just the same with astrology. It's why the planet that we really can't see, that's at the furthest end of the cosmos, is nevertheless extremely powerful. So that's one answer, and it doesn't, it probably isn't satisfying from a perspective of, if you're looking for kind of physical effects, if you're looking for magnetic or gravitational or wave effect or whatever it is, that's not going to be a satisfying explanation. And I don't have an explanation that will satisfy that way of viewing things. The other possibility is that, for one thing that one teacher of mine talked about, and his own theory is that with all these bodies, somehow meaning becomes attached to them in the collective consciousness through use, through astrological practice. So for whatever reason, astrologers got a handle on Pluto. They became interested in it. They started directing their consciousness towards it and imbuing it with meaning. And so many astrologers did this that somehow it actually takes on these meanings, and it starts to even work with the timing. You start to see that these meanings that astrologers have attached to it start to follow this thing around, and everybody can see it. So ultimately, there's parts of astrology that are more accessible to logic, and there are other parts that just really bleed into the realm of high strangeness. We don't really know exactly how this thing works, but those who practice it, those who really investigate it, tend to find that somehow it does.
What's interesting is, do you know Isaac Bentov? You heard his name before? He was an Israeli cardiologist back in the 70s. He died just in a plane crash, just all of a sudden. He did his name's been floating around a little bit more recently because a whole bunch of CIA documents have been declassified about their programs into controlling human consciousness. And I don't remember the name of those documents and I don't know why it was such a big news topic in certain spheres, because he talked about all this in his book, which is Stalking the Wild Pendulum. But he talks about consciousness a lot in that book, and how in his theory is that ancient people, they would, let's say there's this rock that has significance, right? This rock has this big shape, and it's interesting, maybe it looks like a face, and they give it they think it's some sort of god, and over time, because they're imprinting consciousness into it, it actually creates a rudimentary consciousness, and then it goes on from there in different ways. Another interesting thing about Pluto too, if we want maybe a little bit of a hard science way it could affect us, is that it does actually emit X-rays, which are those wavelengths of light which are able to ionize our upper atmosphere to create these telluric currents, which then interact with us bioelectrically at the same frequencies as our brainwaves. So though it's not necessarily a very bright X-ray emitter, let's say. It doesn't emit like it's not like the sun in regards to its power output. It does emit them. It's not zero. It does emit X-rays. And that's because the solar wind sweeping past the sun energizes the Plutonian atmosphere and creates these currents that then release X-ray photons back out. So it's I think what you talked about with like the subconscious mind. It's like sometimes the conscious mind creates these like undercurrents that hit the unconscious and then bring them up to the surface. And that kind of is similar into the fact that, solar wind that was swept out from the sun, our consciousness hits our unconscious Pluto and then creates these return signals in regards to X-rays. And they're very high frequency, means high, like very vibrational, very energetic, high power. But one, maybe this is just a question I've been wanting to ask someone for a while. Like there's a lot of astrology is based on like mythology, like Greek mythology. And in one version of the story with Pluto and Persephone is that it was Cupid that shot Hades, Pluto, with an arrow. So like with astrology, why is the asteroid Eros not like more powerful than Pluto, for example? Or to phrase it maybe a little differently, if someone has a synastry chart, let's say with Pluto conjunct someone else's Eros, and there's a little bit of a thing there, like which one, like what's the dynamic you could say?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So in astrology, we have certain rules that we apply when we're looking at which planet has the upper hand here. If they're facing off, and it's we'll often be looking at things like is it because each of the planets is associated with certain signs, certain places it's said to be more comfortable, more powerful, and so on. And those tend to be the rules that we apply. And we're also looking at the position of the two planets, like vis-a-vis each other. So in Hellenistic astrology, we would see a planet that's earlier on in the zodiac that's looking forward at another one as having a kind of advantage. It's said to be was said to be overcoming the other one. So those are the rules that we tend to apply. There is an element, though, in terms of the meanings of the planets that does stem from mythology, as you say. I've never seen astrologers applying the rules in the way that you say. Like kind of Cupid fires an arrow at Pluto, so he kind of gets one over on Pluto.
Yeah,
so does Cupid always, does Eros or Cupid always win against Pluto? It doesn't seem to work like that, but who knows? I haven't looked into that. That kind of it's a kind of interesting perspective. I might put that to some, because I don't make a huge emphasis on mythology in my astrology. I of course use it; it's important, and you have to. You can't ignore it. But some astrologers really get very deep into it. They know all the stories, they know them all very well, and they can really see any time that a mythological story is playing out in a client's life. They see it because they've memorized all the myths. I'm not actually personally one of those astrologers, but because there's a lot of different ways to practice. But I know some people who are, and I'm definitely going to speak to them about that because I think that's a really interesting idea.
Well, I mentioned it because, it brings together a lot of different factors. It brings together like the science of, okay, Pluto's so far distant. Doesn't have an electromagnetic field other than the one that's induced by the sun. So in terms of hard science, right? Gravitationally has almost no effect on the other planets, like in a measurable way, at least for like us, right? How much is it pulling you around? But then, you have the mythology, which is what astrology is based on, and to some significant degree. And then it goes even further with Eros, which is just a little asteroid. We just put that name on some little asteroid. An asteroid is way smaller than Pluto. It's just interesting to think about those connections and how that applies. And so, like I guess you'll look more into it. Maybe the next podcast, if you do another. You'll have an answer for the Eros Pluto's conjunction synastry. I think that's most people don't look at Eros though; they look like Eris. People get the two confused, but yeah, I thought
Yeah.
I've just been wanting to ask that question to someone that's like knowledgeable in astrology because I just have like I've seen that and I've thought about it and I find it interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of stories, stories like that. You have Saturn eating his children and all that kind
Yeah.
of thing. But in terms of the thing to bear in mind is that I think mythology is very rich, and there are a lot of different stories concerning the same characters and interacting in different ways at different times. So they're not always in the same position vis-a-vis the other mythological figure, so to speak. There's a lot of stories of Persephone and Pluto, for example. They're not always interacting in the same way.
Mm-hmm. We're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm curious as to, let's say, like you're doing this humanitarian work, you discovered astrology, got into that, you have the private consultations now, the private readings, which is cool. Like, and now you have this YouTube channel, right? Like, as someone that's put some time now into YouTube, it's quite a lot of work. I think you've discovered that you have a lot of production value with your videos. I think they're really good. Was there something that you saw in your chart, for example, like your personal natal chart, that was like, okay, astrologically, I have a little bit of a skill here with like digital communication. Was there something that prompted you to make that? Was it really just like, this is something that'll help my business and be good information for people and you enjoy it? Like,
well, I said I worked for a humanitarian organization, but I work doing communications. I mostly do digital communications. So
okay,
that was actually what I was doing. I've been creating content for, a long time, for almost my whole working career, even if it wasn't about astrology. So it was kind of natural to me to just explore different communication channels. And it's making content is something I love to do. And you can see it in my chart. I get confirmation of that from my astrological chart. I have Sun in Leo, got a lot of Gemini placements. It's kind of just adds up to somebody who wants to tell stories and communicate and so on. But I knew that before I went into astrology.
And you have the British voice, which helps. People like the British voice.
Gives me undeserved credibility, maybe for some people.
It also, maybe it's already happened. I mean, we're just like 1 or 2 degrees into Leo, but happy birthday! Got that coming up.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
it.
Did
it happen?
What's that? Not yet.
Did it happen or not yet?
Not yet. August the 4th.
You got your birth season, the whole 30 days, the birth sign. I celebrate the whole time. Great. So then that, Leo brings me back to this Venus retrograde. That's something that's immediately applicable to people watching this as it releases. That's a fairly long transit. It's like 4 months long or so through that one sign. And what's interesting is that it only stays in Leo. It doesn't have any excursions into Virgo. And I'm not sure if there's been Venus retrogrades where it's like dancing around in Cancer a little bit. But are there some societal trends that you see with this Venus retrograde in Leo that you can perhaps talk about? I mean, you said Sun in Leo is one of these things that helps you be a bit of a good communicator, the performer. I have tons of Leo in my chart. What do you think we're going to see maybe collectively, societally, with this Venus retrograde in Leo? Like a lot of drama, or?
I mean, well, Leo is one of the signs that people associate a bit with drama, probably more than your average sign. But yeah, so
more
Venus
than Capricorn.
Definitely more than Capricorn. Yeah. So I think one of the things that we can expect to see is somehow Venusian stories, so stories that have to do with image or desire or beauty or aesthetics or love stories and all these kind of things. They're going to be playing out in Leo, a sign that has to do with the self, with being seen, being recognized. So we may see some stories of people wanting to be seen or feeling like they're not being seen as much as they'd like, or kind of changes in image, changes in how we show ourselves to the world. And what's interesting, you might know that Twitter has just rebranded itself, right? It's an X now. Yeah, it's suddenly, Elon has decided to rebrand Twitter right at this retrograde. I mean, Venus is really just stationed retrograde, and we're getting this rebrand of of something extremely visible. Twitter is one of the most well-known social networks in the world. Elon Musk, maybe one of the most famous men in the world. So we have this kind of change of image taking place. But we're also probably going to get a story around this, because we had this rebrand at the retrograde, but being well, with that in mind, we're probably going to see more to this rebrand story. I would not be too surprised. Now, as Venus retrogrades, maybe as people go and write to Elon and tell him how much they hate this new brand, or maybe, or whatever it is, that there may be, I mean, he himself has said that he's going to tweak it, and that's kind of been his approach to Twitter, right? He just changes things quite quickly and then sees what happens. And I suspect that's what he's done with the Twitter logo. And I also suspect that that's going to be a story that we'll see with this retrograde. And people will see similar stories playing out in their own lives that have to do with things they desire, people they desire, how they feel seen in their relationships, perhaps how they present themselves. And these kind of stories are going to play out over the next few weeks.
So it's interesting. You said you're a Leo, and you're not a first decan Leo either. So you're like second decan or so. Now with Venus retrograding, and then my chart, I have Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Chiron, some other points. Like literally, if I type in like a new asteroid, it usually pops up there. So I think scientifically, here's the sun, 99.86% of the mass of the solar system, this massive electromagnetic body that's blasting out solar wind, that's, creating these magnetic storms on Earth and also on Jupiter and Saturn and any planet that has these fields. And those seem to affect human consciousness. I have a lot of people on my channel that talk about, feeling health disruptions from things like that. So the sun's hugely important. So with this Venus retrograde, this planetary geometry sweeping past, I have multiple points. You have do you have just the one?
Well, I have the sun, and then I also have the North Node and part of Fortune. But in terms of planets, yes, just the sun.
Okay, so if we just condense it to the sun, will that be? I don't expect a concrete answer, but is that more impactful when Venus will let's say go over your sun versus it hitting multiple points for me? How can you kind of is the quantity of points an outweighing factor, or is the sun, because of its dynamic? I think you get what I'm.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah. So one thing that we tend to principle we tend to apply in astrology is, so we have the natal placements, we have our natal planets, where the planets were at our birth, and we have the transiting planets. Now, the slower a transiting planet, the more impactful it is. That's one thing about Pluto, right? Pluto moves, yes, it's small, yes, it's far away, but it moves extremely slowly. So if it's on your natal placement, it's there for years, basically, which gives it this great power. And then a fast-moving planet will tend to, because it moves so fast, it's really producing or it's signifying things that can be over in a day when it hits a natal placement. And then but then at the same time, generally, the more personal a planet is natally, so in your natal chart, say the Sun, Mercury, Venus, like these kind of very personal planets, when they receive transits, you tend to feel it more. It tends to be more obvious. Whereas if you have, say, a Mercury transit to a fast-moving Mercury, right? Planet transit to Pluto, which is natally, if it's a very slow-moving planet natally, it will tend to not really amount to much. So, Mercury's on my Pluto. You might, probably not going to be much of anything, or at least less likely to be. So that's one part of the answer. It kind of depends on, like, the very fast planets in your natal chart. When they get hit, you're gonna see stuff more likely. I wouldn't say, you have like 4 planets all in the same sign. So I would have. It can get hard to tease apart what's going on when you get this sort of like rapid, these rapid transits happening. Yeah, that they can almost tend to bleed into one, so to speak. So it might become harder for you to perceive what's going on with each of those hits. But I do think you are likely to feel it, because this is a really important part of your chart. You have this like huge concentration of planets all in Leo. You got the Leo hair, there's a lot of there's a lot of Leo here. So I would have thought that this will be quite big for you when you have a Venus retrograde over all those planets in Leo.
We'll see what happens. I hope for the best. Slobby Bog. It means glory to God in Russian. I say it all the time right now with me studying. That's the thing. It's like I don't have as much time as I would like to journal, because I'm just trying to just constantly do studying, and my hand is actually like getting tired from all the writing. But I will find a way to record all of this. Typically, these things come to me in my dreams. I have a very impactful dreams. And is there anything, you said Neptune governs over dreams? So if someone has strong dreams, where that's like an important, because that's a huge part of consciousness. I mean, we have our normal waking consciousness, but like, have you ever had a lucid dream before?
Once or twice, quite a while ago.
Yeah, so you only need one to recognize that, like in a lucid dream, even if it's pretty brief, it's like in many ways more real than real life. So, I mean, if I'm sitting here in this chair right now and I'm receiving, you can see the room and whatever, but it's all just at the end of the day, like these electromagnetic signals, plus a little bit of like something that we don't know, or a lot of something we don't know. But when you're laying there sleeping, you see everything, you can feel everything. It's no different. It's just like a different state of consciousness. And I don't feel like it's any lesser than our waking consciousness. And in many ways, because it's so real and so vivid, it seems to almost be like a higher state of consciousness. So what, I guess using astrology, like Neptune governs over dreams, like maybe where the houses, do we see anything changing there? I know like Saturn's in Pisces, but that is like, I guess I'm like my biggest downloads, uploads, whatever you want to call them, through my dreams. And if we have like a mass collective shift there, that can be super impactful. And I feel like this maybe ties into the story of 2026 and so on. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Like you totally pick up on these things through dreams. Neptune is the planet that's generally associated with dreams and the imagination and so on. But what I tend to find, so in general, we see the moon as being the body that really kind of makes things happen and makes things material, transmits them into our material reality somehow. You can really see astrological placements, what's going on, by looking at what the moon's doing and looking at what you're dreaming about. It really, I find it happens. You need to be paying attention. You need to be, obviously, you need to be able to remember your dreams. You need to be somebody who's noting them down. And then it's kind of quite difficult because you kind of have to understand the astrological symbolism pretty well, but you can really track this by like, which sign is the moon in? Which planet is it? If the moon is, say, applying to a conjunction with Mars, You know, will you have a sort of conflict in your dreams? Will you be fighting somehow? Oh, it's opposing Saturn. Are you being blocked? Are you being frustrated? It's making, you know, or when Saturn's involved, often you might be in a cold place. You might be in an old setting. Say if the moon's in Capricorn, you're suddenly in a very old, traditional, institutional environment, say. The moon's in Libra. You're at a party. You know, I really see it. And I've been noticing a lot more. Like I've been remembering my dreams a lot more lately. Neptune has just stationed retrograde. So there's maybe some intensification of Neptunian significations at the moment. But yeah, you can absolutely do that. Because I think you're right. Like we're a lot of this stuff, we're picking it up subconsciously. And where can we see it? We can see it in our dreams. So you can see the astrology playing out there.
Yeah, I do dream journaling. I started that as a kid. You know, there's certain things that like happen early in life. I wondered why. And one of them is like, why did I have this interest with dream journaling when I was just like in my, I guess like a teenager? And I didn't stay with it long, but I have the journal where I wrote down like 4 or 5 dreams. And then I did it various times, and now I'm pretty consistent. And I write recently, past year and a half, I write down the astrological aspects. So I've noticed dreams that are, I've had precognition dreams that have come true. And I've noticed those happen often, like vivid dreams, or the few precognition ones I've had, happen with new moons or full moons, and then also retrogrades or directs. Like, you know, those moments where they're changing. But that's interesting because that is Earth-based. That's based on the Earth's rotation around the sun. I mean, that planet is still, it's not stopping its direction. It's just simply because the Earth is now, you know, either outpacing it or whatever. Typically it'd be like the Earth's going faster. Which is interesting because there's a little bit of like the future idea. Let's say Elon gets his way and we have people on Mars. Like, is that going to be a whole new field of astrology? Like Mars-based astrology, like radically different. The forces, astrological forces acting on you are just going to be totally different because now the sun's 2 years and Jupiter's going to be a little faster. Well, I'm not sure about that because then there's going to be these big moments apart. But the conjunctions will be closer. Like, do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, no, that's super, obviously a super fun thing to think about. What would astrology be like in another planets? Because yeah, our perspective here on Earth is very important. And presumably there's some sense in which, you know, this is the environment that we're in, that there's a very earthiness to our lives. And what I mean by that is that, who knows, but when you're living on Mars, does everything feel different? Is everything Marsy? Is it kind of competitive and aggressive and so on? And the other thing, of course, is if we're on Mars, then we'll be getting transits of the Earth. What's an Earth transit like?
Yeah,
oh, cool.
Exactly.
I've got Earth conjunct my moon today. Sweet.
That sounds
good.
Dope.
Eat a chocolate bar or something, you know, so whatever it is.
Well, I think about that too with the moon, because that's probably what will settle. If not like before, like around the same time. And the moon is so fast. I mean, maybe the moon will just be like a party planet all the time. I mean, things are happening so quickly with the moon cycle. I mean, I guess the Pluto would still be kind of slow, but
yeah. Does Mars? No. Mars has is it Phobos? Is it just one moon?
2, but they're like
2.
I mean, you could probably pick it up. It's so small.
Well, you know, those
little rocks.
Those moons would then become important, right? Those would be the kind of transmitters of stuff. So you have 2 moons. It'd be kind of interesting to think about how that might work.
As you imprint the consciousness on them.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's pretty clearly something special about our moon, and what I mean by that is just the fact that the moon is pretty much the same size, apparently, to us as the sun, and that's just an incredible astronomical coincidence. Like, even if you don't believe in all this woo-woo astrology stuff, you have to wonder at that. Like, because the chances of that are so incredibly small. The moon is exactly the right size and distance to cover the sun precisely, or almost precise, you know, very close to precise. And that's the only moon, as far as I'm aware, in our solar system that does that. So no other planet has a moon that is equal in sort of apparent visual weight somehow to the sun. And that's like incredible. And that's one of the things that I realized that quite a while ago before I got into astrology. And when I did realize it, I found it quite incredible. I was like, this is something to wonder at. And this is something to make you, ponder, what are the chances of this? Because we, as far as we're aware, we have one planet in this solar system that has conscious minds that could appreciate such a thing. And there we are. We have the two symbols, the giver of light and the reflector of light, being perfectly balanced. And there's something very elegant and very strange and almost miraculous about that.
Yeah, there's no moon on Mercury. Venus has no moon. Mars has this little asteroids. Jupiter has some moons, which are bigger than ours, but it's so far, it's 5.2 astronomical units away. We're one. Earth is 1 AU away. This leads me to a couple of questions. But first, I just want to ask your thoughts. This is a little thought experiment I've had, which would not work in reality. But what are your thoughts on us getting a second moon? We pull Pluto into orbit around the Earth, and we have a dual moon system. I think that'd be dope. Or
not Pluto. Not
good?
Pluto. We don't want
Not
Pluto like that close to Earth. I know too well what Pluto does in astrology, and we keep that thing at a distance.
Way away. Okay. So, I was thinking that Pluto would thaw out and become like this water world, like this pleasure planet or something that you just jet off to for the weekend. But I guess it wouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Another thing that people have experimented with, I've seen that there's an astrologer that's developed a system where he's looking at the planets, but then also looking at what their moons are doing. So he's like, sort of say looking at Jupiter and seeing if Titan is like facing Earth, or if it's like facing away, or whatever it is, and he's adjusting his astrological prognostications based on this stuff, which is very out there. I don't really know. There's hardly any astrologers that do this kind of stuff, but there are. It does raise a lot of questions, especially if in the future we're able to move off the Earth. What does that, if assuming which I believe astrology is a valid phenomenon, what happens to astrology in other parts of the cosmos, and what happens if you mess with the geometry of the solar system? Do you change the metaphysics that we live in? And what's what about other star systems? Do they have different astrologies? Do their planets do they have different metaphysics there, or do they have different kind of a sort of different reality with different forces that we can't even imagine because we don't have those planets in our sky? Or is it always the same kind of forces? You always have a planet that kind of acts like Saturn, and you have one that acts like Venus. Who knows? There's all sorts of crazy places you could take that kind of thinking.
Yeah, well, based on our limited astronomical data, our solar system's pretty unique. The fact that we have so many planets. But I think that's going to change as we just take better measurements, and also we're just measuring from a point. That's why I have a lot of problems with modern science, is that a lot of people are like, oh, we know everything. It's like we're doing all these measurements from a single point source within this universe. And so I think the actual difference, in terms astronomy and astrology, I think they're actually much closer together in terms of how much rigor we can put behind them than people want to believe or think. And I think astrology, well, also astronomy, but I think astrology is a huge wide open field. I really see it as being a big area of growth for our kind of society, and also, of course, for a lot of people and groups over the next few decades or more. Because of things like looking at the moons of Jupiter and how they're aspecting each other, and then how that's influencing, let's say, Jupiter's energy, and then how that feeds to us. And certainly that's going to resonate with certain people. Some people have a resonance to certain planets, oh yeah, I like Venus, so I like Mercury or whatever. And so anyone that's they like any Jupiter themes or Zeus, they just feel connection there. They're going to want to subscribe, let's say, to that person's channel, or read his book, or her Substack, or whatever it is. And I think there's going to be maybe too much information available in the future on all this, and it's going to be how do you keep up? Who's going to be who are the people going to be that are integrating this and kind of summarizing it and making it concise and then delivering the more holistic, like whole package? That's, I mean, that's kind of what I try to do with my channel. But is there what? I guess that leads me to think like, what signs exist for that aspect in the chart? Like Mercury is like the mind. So on, and then we talked about Leo being a little bit of like a performer, or at least not being afraid of being in a public setting. But what type of aspects or planets or just anything astrological that kind of point to the people that are able to like bring it all together, like the Renaissance man,
Jupiter,
the Leonardo da Vinci? That's Jupiter.
So I mean, the two planets that have to do with knowledge in astrology are Mercury and Jupiter.
Okay.
Mercury is, as you say, the rational mind. Mercury likes to analyze, take things apart, figure out how they work, do detailed research, calculate, interpret, etc. Jupiter is about bring it all together. Jupiter is expansion. It's like we bring more and more into our understanding with Jupiter. We get a big vision. So that's totally Jupiterian. Jupiter wants to have a vision that takes everything in somehow. That's very Jupiterian. Yeah.
Now, what are the signs that Jupiter does well in? It's Cancer, right? Is it Cancer and Pisces?
So Jupiter,
Sagittarius.
Jupiter rules Sagittarius and Pisces, so it's said to be in domicile, so it likes to be there. And then it's we say it's exalted in Cancer, so yeah, it likes to be in Cancer a lot as well. And it does pretty well in all the fire signs, Leo, Aries, and obviously Sag, as I mentioned.
Well, that's what I was kind of getting to, is that like I have Jupiter in my Leo. And I feel like that's a strong placement because Leo is connected to the sun, and Jupiter is literally a proto-sun. It's like not the sun yet, but if you take like a star rating, a scale, and you show our sun, middle age, and then you show like a brown dwarf, Jupiter is not that much smaller than like a brown dwarf. If you were to like collide Saturn into it and maybe add some other stuff, it could, potentially like, we don't know the physics, but
you're sort of channeling some astrological wisdom there in a strange way, because in Hellenistic astrology, they divided the traditional planets into two sort of teams. We call them sects, where they're kind of planets that work together. There was a day sect and a night sect. So if you were born during the day planets are kind of more on your side, and the day planets are the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. If you were born during the night, then the night planets are your sect, your side. We have the Moon, Venus, and Mars on the night sect. But Jupiter is on the Sun's team, right? And we have this. There are other ways of classifying the signs. Classify them according to the triplicities, meaning the elements, right? So we have fire signs, air signs, earth signs, water signs. The triplicity of the fire signs, Jupiter does really well in with the Sun, and so you're using the physical realities of the cosmos there to you're somehow coming to similar conclusions that the ancients came to. That's one of the weirdest things about astrology, because there were lots of strange connections between the astronomical reality and how ancient peoples saw the different planets. For example, Jupiter has always been seen as about expansiveness and growth and bigness and importance. But Jupiter is of course the biggest of the planets, and we know that. But they wouldn't, the ancient Hellenists, in like say 1000 BC or whatever, they weren't able to look at this in a telescope, at least not as far as we're aware. They didn't know that Jupiter was big. I mean, it's the same with Saturn. Saturn was associated with limits and with structure. The structure is a classic signification of Saturn. And of course, Saturn has the rings. Saturn's the only planet. There were rings around some of the other planets, but nowhere near as kind of obviously and like iconically as Saturn. And then at the same time, Mercury was seen as a planet of duality, Mercury was not part of either of this day sect or night sect. It was said to be able to go on either side.
Yeah.
Mercury was said to be, when Mercury's with a good planet, Mercury's good. When Mercury's with a bad planet, Mercury's bad. This is how they saw Mercury. It was like kind of two-faced. Now, what do we know about Mercury? In reality, Mercury is tidally locked around the sun. So the same side of Mercury always faces the sun. So one half of Mercury is always completely light, bright, and the other half is always in darkness. There's this sort of duality to Mercury. You can see it really plainly astronomically, and somehow ancient peoples kind of knew this.
Yeah, I mean, there's the astrology versus astronomy, and then there's like astrology plus astronomy, and I like that one more because I think there's a lot more to get from that. I knew about the tidal lock with Mercury. That's interesting that you mentioned duality. I mean, it's also associated with the twins, Gemini. I have Mercury placements in my chart, so I'll have to think about that. But yeah, I mean, the mythology of Mercury too is that he was one of the few gods that could go into the underworld and be like, "Yo, what up, Hades?" and just like bounce out, right? They're like
exactly the psycho pump.
Yeah, because there's Chiron, who's the ferryman. Is that right? The
Chiron
souls across. Yeah, and so he would accompany. Often, if Zeus is like, "Okay, you need to go visit Hades," then he would send Mercury with that god. And then he would get them back out, and Hades would claim the soul of that person, nymph or whatever. So yeah, it's interesting how this information energy seems to exist not just in like some of these more nebulous fields, and not just in more of the material scientific realms, but across a whole bunch of areas. And also, it existed, it seems, before we had some of these ways of perceiving them, let's say like with the telescopes like you were talking about, which then leads me to think about, like, on my channel I talk a lot about these energy fields called the Schumann resonances. And are you aware of those?
I've watched your channel a bit, but apart from that, I wasn't too well aware of them. Yeah,
I stumbled upon them somehow, and as I researched into them, both from like a geophysical background, because I went to school for geology, went into the workforce as a geophysicist, but then also always having a big interest in health and wellness. I started to put the two together, and tons of researchers have looked at the overlap between like human consciousness and brain waves and heart rhythms, among other things, and these Schumann resonances, because they have the same frequency, the same power. They can enter into phase with each other and enable like energy and information transfer. Like your hippocampus, which is your spatial awareness, your memory, your perception of time, your temporal lobe, right? That pulses at an 8 hertz Schumann frequency at the same strength. And so it seems that there's there's a growing amount of evidence that there is, let's say, like a collective consciousness field that is to some degree, and I think to a significant degree, based on electromagnetism. So just based on light, just photons, that's our current best paradigm understanding, but based on light. And so it seems that this energy and information is stored in this field, and that these ancients, by pondering and dwelling on these things, were able to kind of get these, let's say, downloads. But it makes you wonder if the information has to be like uploaded at the beginning, or whether it can also feed back in time. I know we're kind of getting a little into the metaphysics now, but like I've had experiences that it just seemed like to me, like it just seemed to resonate to me that what I did in this moment or this period of time is actually what influenced some past cycle for me. And there's some quantum evidence for that. So just like to hear your thoughts on that from the astrology perspective, just you, Dan, as a person, what your thoughts are, your life experience.
Yeah, I that's pretty far out stuff, but I as an astrologer, I see how the future influences the past, or how it seems to they seem to play into each other quite often. You can when you know that you have some sort of transit that's coming up in the future, say some sort of I don't know, like you know that Mars is going to be conjoining your moon, say, in 3 days' time, and this is the sort of transit that you might say one way you might delineate that is you might expect that you could have some sort of accident or some sort of health incident. Say that's just one possibility, but Mars Moon
conjunction.
Okay. Yeah. So Mars Moon conjunction coming up, but say in order for that to happen, I need to be in a certain place. Say I need to because what will happen at that time is say I'm playing football and like somebody tackles me or whatever, and I get injured, right? But I'm only playing football because I've gone to see a friend in Manchester, and so several days earlier I've bought I wasn't planning to go, then my friend phones up and says come stay with us in Manchester, we're having a party, we're going to play football, it's going to be fun. So I say, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then suddenly I've been put on the timeline that kind of allows this Mars Moon accident thing to happen. So there's some way in which every moment in time is playing into every subsequent and previous moment in time. There's just nothing but flow, essentially. And so it's not a too difficult an idea for me to grasp that that the future may play into the past. You can also imagine that it's quite possible that we're just beings who are forced to experience time linearly, but any imagined spiritual being which is not bound by time, is not in this same material, Saturn's kind of material time-bound domain, can see all of time happening at once. It's all simultaneous, and therefore the connections run both ways. We just experience things from the past to the future.
One thing I just thought of with this conversation, because this is something I've been thinking about recently, but I have my own personal life experiences that kind of lead me to believe that there's something here, which is like every action can be considered like a wave generator. Like you drop a pebble, it creates a wave, and it ripples out in both directions, or all directions. And so if every action is creating some sort of wave, whether it's small or large, that perhaps is rippling both directions in time. But maybe this is just my ability to use English to convey this idea that makes me think that this idea exists, right? Because we could use our actual just linguistic ability to combine words to give ourselves like perceptions of reality or what happens. But
that's what Wittgenstein said. He just said that essentially we're playing these language games, and our language allows us to come up with these ideas that that are impossible, essentially, that aren't real.
I think that's definitely true. Like, why are the nodes so significant?
Well,
I mean, it seems kind of arbitrary. It's just the ecliptic points, but maybe it's not.
Well, geometrically, in terms of the geometry, the nodes are important, because essentially, the nodes are, as I'm sure you know, of course, they're where the path of the moon meets the path of the sun, the ecliptic, right? So there's 2 points where those two things intersect. Now, why is that interesting? Well, because it's only when the moon is when the sun or the moon are close to the nodes that we get eclipses, right? And eclipses are, going back all the way to the very beginning of astrology, have always been seen as important and powerful. And the nodes show you where the eclipsing points are. So, I mean, you can see from like a geometrical perspective, you've got two circles around the Earth, and the nodes are their points of intersection. Those are kind of important geometric points, given that those are the two, the sun and the moon are so important in terms of the bodies around us. But just from an astrological history perspective, they show the eclipsing points. So they've always been very important.
I guess to to elaborate more on my question, because yeah, the eclipses have been significant since the dawn of time, the dawn of time, clearly. But like, for example, there's some buzz right now because the nodes just moved into a new sign, but it's not eclipse season yet. So I mean, are they significant? Are they significant in a big way, or are they kind of bomb the wave when it's, let's say, like the solstice, when the moon is furthest away from that ecliptic point? Because yeah, geometrically, I can see how it really makes sense when the moon is like sitting there or close to there and swinging past them at that time. But it seems like the nodes switching signs when it's not near eclipse season really wouldn't seem to have that big of an impact. And maybe it's just, I think in astrology sometimes you get people that go like a little bit too far with like some like we see this and we're going to read into the situation like 120% or something. I like the node switching signs in astrology would be important, but maybe it doesn't become super important until it becomes like near eclipse season. We have those first eclipses in those new signs. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just on purely the nodes just changing signs, unless they're hitting something directly in your chart, you're not really going to probably going to experience too much there. But these are somehow sensitive points. Like in Vedic astrology, they're known as Rahu and Ketu, the head and tail of the dragon, and they're treated as planets in Vedic astrology. So they just consider them just the same, essentially, even though they're invisible. We have to calculate where they are. I think this really goes back to the consciousness of ancient peoples who conceptualized what was happening at the eclipses as, the sun was being eaten here by a dragon. It was being blocked out and consumed and was invisible for a certain amount of time. Or the moon turns blood red. Something must have done that. And that's what the nodes are conceived as, these points in space that do that. Maybe we're looking again at a similar process to what we've had with like Pluto. I was talking about how with all these human consciousnesses directed towards Pluto and imbuing it with power and meaning, we've had the same thing happen with the nodes. You can have that with anything. So that's a possible way to think about it, that these are just somehow abstract points that nevertheless human consciousness is focused on enough that it becomes important.
I also think it's important, like a spiritual practice and just in life in general, to like free yourself from control as much as you can to really live like as a sovereign, independent individual. And I met someone recently who is knowledgeable in astrology, and we were talking about a little bit. We had a little bit, maybe some conflicting ideas. This is a more conducive environment to discuss these things. But regardless, he said like, oh, I have my sun in the 9th house, so I literally cannot stop traveling and exploring the world. And so like thinking about the eclipses, right? And that's a big theme, travel, philosophy, other stuff at 9th house. But I think with the eclipse, okay, here you have the sun beaming out light energy in all directions. And the Earth occupies a small little point vector for that. And then, okay, so we get our energy stream from the sun, and then the moon comes in. It says, okay, I'm going to take that. And that affects our consciousness, right? There's all these things, and people make videos on it or write books or talk about it, whatever. And, there's evidence, plenty of evidence, that it has big importance on Earth. But if you just fly a little spaceship, just slightly away from Earth, there's no eclipse. You see the sun, it doesn't stop shining. It's the whole time, it's fine. So like I feel like you can channel that consciousness of that person in the spaceship even if you are there on Earth. And as a result, you can distance yourself from that energetic flow. And as a result, perhaps like some of the power that it has. So like what are your thoughts on like, because astrology can be difficult. If you get really wrapped up into it, you really build these like thought constructions of like what's going to happen and stuff. It can really it can trigger emotional currents in you, like emotional stress and mental like overload, let's say. It can be useful, but it also has its Mercury shadow side. And so what are your thoughts on you know, distancing yourself from astrology when it's beneficial, being that little guy in the spaceship? It's like, yep, no eclipse for me. Sun's still shining, it's totally fine.
Yeah, this is absolutely something that can happen. Astrology can be very powerful. It can take over people's lives. You know, they can really start to feel completely governed and under the sway of the planets and what they think is going to happen to them. Um, this this is a phase of people's like astrological practice, and that they kind of go through that phase and then move beyond it. What I try to bear in mind myself is that astrology is the map, right? It's not the territory, and the territory is our lives, and that's primary. I don't. I try not to obsess and focus on the astrology too much, because ultimately we're here to live life, not to kind of follow follow what the map says about what's happening. That said, I have seen just in the course of practicing astrology over the years that I think we are more governed by fate than we think, but I don't know if we're completely governed by it. Like there was a famous example of an Indian saint, I forget his name, some sort of meditation enlightenment kind of figure, who wanted to prove that we aren't completely bound by astrology. So I think he tried to prove that he could do something successfully on the worst possible day predicted by his astrologers. To be honest, I forget what it was he did. Maybe he had his birthday party on like a Saturn Pluto conjunction on his sun or something. But he wanted to just prove that he could do that. As his argument was, we're not completely subject to fate. If you learn about Indian astrology, they and in fact broader than that, just in Indian cosmology and thinking, they have different kinds of karma. There's changeable karma, and there's sort of easily changeable karma that you can change with great effort, and stuff that you just can't change. And I suspect that that's kind of how things are. I've tried to avoid transits coming to pass, and they've come and found me wherever I was. I remember one time I knew that there was a rough Saturn Pluto. I think it was a opposition or a conjunction on one of my planets, and I saw this coming a couple of weeks off. And I was living in Bali at the time, and on the day of the conjunction, I was supposed to climb a volcano, and I was like, nah, I'm not doing that. That's clearly a terrible idea. That's how I ended up getting killed. So I didn't go on this volcano trek, and instead I stayed at home, and ended up having a huge fight with one of my neighbors.
Wow.
So it was this kind of violent, aggressive looking transit. I tried to avoid it, and it found me, wherever yeah. But that said, yeah, I don't think it's impossible. And I think it pays not to obsess too much, because ultimately we don't really know enough as well to be afraid. Even if we think we know what a transit's going to be or what's going to happen, it can often surprise us. So it's, even if it were true that we were completely bound by fate, I think it's always worth living as if you are in charge of your life and responsible for it.
Those who seek control are sometimes the most controlled. Maybe that's how it works out. So it makes me think, though, you mentioned how there's the different types of karma. I've heard about that before. I believe that that rings true in my life. So if the astrology on our planet has, specific, we talked about the astrology of Mars a little bit, and the astrology of Mars is different than it is on Earth, then this would seem to imply that there's some sort of like fabric of fate that changes across space-time. And I think that the connection between physicality, like our physical body, right, and the spiritual dimension is really interesting, because there is a connection between the two. yet sometimes it can seem that they're very separate, that like your physical body has no influence on your spiritual body or whatever. But if like perhaps you change your fate to some degree by, if you have the technology, right, to go to that place where the fate is different. And that's like, I guess, a new level of free will that will come to us with something like space travel. But then, of course, now you have that fate that you have to deal with. And did you even learn astrology to begin with? Did you know this thing? And then did you study it to see which planet, let's say, has the best like fate for you? I find that all interesting. Like at the end of the day, it's just you're still playing within this game. But what are your thoughts on this fabric of fate? I mean, I know there's like astrocartography, and these astro lines that cut through cities and countries and everything. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I use that as part of my practice. If people come and want to know where might it be better for them to live, where would they be more like to thrive, so they, you know, we move to different places. We have techniques for kind of judging which planets are likely to be more influential in which parts of the world. You can have a map with different lines, and so people often want to live on their Jupiter line or their Venus line, or avoid their Saturn line and Mars line and so on. But you see, yeah, so I do practice that, and if I look back at what's happened to me in different parts of the world, because I've lived in a lot of different countries, so I can kind of see it. There is definitely, to my mind, in my life, I see a real convergence between what the lines say and the kind of events that happened in my life in those places. But I don't know if you're really, by doing that, whether it's moving to a different country or moving to a different planet, are you really sidestepping fate, or were you just fated to do that? I don't know. I don't know if you kind of somehow just completely flip it, and God's like, oh, I didn't expect him to do that. Well, I guess he can do whatever he wants now.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's winning the chess game against God. I just find these things fun to think about because it helps, I think, by sometimes like going one step outside of our current kind of understanding, that helps you to better understand, like to see what we have, and to better kind of like, oh, it's not this shade of blue, it's actually that shade of blue, or perhaps, oh, it can look like this sometimes. I mean, like Mercury, for example, if you were geostationary on Mercury as like little satellite on the dark side, you'd only see the dark side. You'd never know that bright side of Mercury exists. So I appreciate you joining for the fourth podcast, Stefan Burns Live, for sharing your astrological knowledge and for engaging with me on some of these fun thought experiments and filling in some of these gaps. We come at this with quite a, I mean, I say astrology, but I also very much into like astronomy and geophysics and bioelectricity. There's a couple of things we didn't necessarily get to that in as much detail as I would have liked, but perhaps in the future. So thanks for being here and for doing your work. Again, World Astrology Report, folks, for anyone that wants to go watch these videos, some really good ones, especially on like the geopolitical balance. I found them very interesting. Any closing thoughts or things that you'd like to ask, or just anything in general, Dan, that you'd like to share? Feel free.
No, it's just been really interesting talking, Stefan. I would definitely like us to talk again, and maybe see if we can collaborate on something, or maybe I can persuade you to come on my channel
Sure.
at some point, because the intersection between astronomy and astrology is super interesting and super important. I think I have this kind of theory about science, that we were somehow we needed to go through this phase of kind of extreme materialism, where we discounted spirit, we discounted the possibility that the gods or whatever or spirits were making us do what we do and making things happen, and that to take this purely materialist view and to develop the science that we've developed. I think that had to happen, and it's good that it happened. But I also think that was done at the expense of a very valid and real part of the world and reality, which is the realm of spirit and things that astrology taps into. And what I expect is going to happen over the next few hundred years is there's going to be eventually a kind of rejoining or remerging of these fields that are seen as different now. Somehow we'll be able to come back to them anew and create an understanding of the world that kind of brings both of those perspectives together. And so I think conversations like this are important, and I hope we can have more of them.
Yeah, I hope so. Sometimes I wonder why I was like, if you believe in reincarnation, multiple lives, all this stuff, like why I was born during this time. Because yeah, it is that kind of, it seems, this apex. And maybe it's going to go even further, things like this, the Apple goggles they got coming out. But regardless, yeah, I think it's up to people like us and others soon to be to kind of help bring these things together once again. I think about how sometimes I wish I was born like the Neolithic, like 7,000 years ago. You have your little village and you're like, oh, you see the stars, but it's strong spiritual communities. But without all the, like a lot of noise and nonsense of today, but there's a lot of good stuff there too. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation otherwise. So yeah, I'd love to go on your channel if the moment comes when we do another astrology related podcast or anything you want to announce. If you have like an announcement that's coming up, just let me know. We can do that. And thank you everyone for watching this video. Again, highly recommend you go to Dan's channel, check out his website. That's danwaitesastrology.com. There's links in the video description. You can click on all of them to your heart's content. If you like this podcast, click the like button, subscribe. Hope to see you all in future videos. And yeah, have a great day, and we'll see you all in the next one. Ciao.
See you.